I'm Jessica, the Museum Guide, and today I'm exploring Tudor Christmas traditions at Anne Boleyn's childhood home, Hever Castle. On our tour today, we're going to explore the life of Anne Boleyn here in her childhood home while we experience the 12 days of Christmas and how they were celebrated in the 16th century. For the first time in nearly 500 years, each of the rooms in the Boleyns' apartment has been decorated in period-appropriate decorations, and there's a brilliant seasonal cheer in the air. The grounds and gardens for which Hever Castle is known are bedecked in lights, Alice in Wonderland decorations, laser shows, and funfair rides, all in celebration of the season, and I may partake in a mulled wine or two. Now, as I mentioned, this was the childhood home of Anne Boleyn, and it was also the primary residence of Anne of Cleves after her annulment from Henry VIII. Other notable inhabitants here have included Sir John Falstaff and William Waldorf Astor, but today we are just focusing on the Tudor period. Let me know if you'd be interested in another Hever Castle video, and maybe I'll come back in the summer. Now, if you're new here, I'd like to say welcome to my channel, and if you're a returning subscriber, welcome back. For those of you that are interested in getting even more content, including at least one extra full-length video tour a month, head on over to my Patreon, which I've just linked above, and it's also linked down below. Over there, I do extra video tours, write blogs, share my thoughts, and I even offer 2 in-person free tours a year to my patrons, so I'd love to see you there. Now, before we head inside, let's stroll around the castle and grounds, and I'm going to tell you a bit about the history of the house and the story of Anne Boleyn's life. Then we'll delve into Christmas indoors. Hever Castle's origins date back to 1270. The gatehouse here and a walled bailey still survive from this time. Then it was converted into a proud manor home in 1462 under Geoffrey Boleyn, and it remained the seat of the Boleyn family until 1539. Anne Boleyn's father Thomas inherited it in 1505 upon the death of his father, and he lived here with his wife Lady Elizabeth Howard and their children George, Mary, and Anne. During this period, Thomas Boleyn was an important figure in Henry VIII's court, being knighted during the king's coronation in 1509. A few generations earlier, Geoffrey Boleyn had made the leap from yeoman farmer to Lord Mayor of London, and the Boleyns remained an important political family. Though Henry VIII was 18 and Thomas was in his early 30s, they were friendly, and Thomas was still young enough and spry and athletic enough to enjoy jousting and the revelry for which Henry was known. More important, he spoke French, and he could represent Henry's interests as the king flirted with a new war with France. We'll come back to Anne's life, but for now, let's head inside and see how the Boleyns would celebrate Christmas when Anne was young. We're starting here in the entrance hall, which was added to the 14th century manor house in the mid-16th century by Anne of Cleves. This is one of her 3 additions to survive, along with the staircase gallery and long gallery, both of which we'll visit later on. But for now, let's head to the Boleyns' apartments. We're now in the parlor room downstairs. We can see the painted fabrics on the wall. These were a more affordable alternative to woven tapestries, and these were really popular at the time, as were these Turkish carpets. And just look at this gorgeous basket. It's filled with pine cones, lavender, dried citrus, and berries, all sitting on a woven Turkish rug. These rugs were huge status symbols in Tudor times. Candles are lit, there's some greens and pine cones in the fireplace. We'll see a nice lit one soon. There's a massive wreath hung on the wall made of evergreen boughs woven through with mistletoe. This must be Christmas Eve, as that's when the Tudors just started decorating for the upcoming days of feasting, games, and revelry. I know now we do it in November, but back then it was on Christmas Eve. And to understand that, we need a bit more information about the structure of a Tudor Christmas. So let's talk about the 12 days of Christmas. No, not the song, but the 12 days of celebrations. They're vital to us understanding this tour of the castle. Now, the 12 days of Christmas date back to the year 567, and that's when the Council of Tours proclaimed that from the fourth Sunday before Christmas Eve through to Christmas Eve, this would be called the Advent period, and people should abstain from pleasures like meat, cheese, butter, milk, eggs, and even fish. This was all in preparation for 12 days of feasting and fun. Everyone, even the poor, stopped working for the 12 days of Christmas. And as I mentioned, the decorations didn't happen until Christmas Eve, so we can see that this room and the grand chamber upstairs are decorated in a beautiful festive way, probably in celebration of the 24th. Of course, Anne Boleyn is big business here at Hever Castle, so let's go check out the gift shop. There's so many things in here. I mean, tea towels, stuffed animals, all kinds of mugs and t-shirts. These all make really good gifts, actually. On that note, I'm getting ready to send out all of my Christmas gifts, and I love to give homemade presents whenever possible. That's why I've signed up for Craftsy, the sponsor of today's video. Craftsy is a unique video platform that gives you instant access to hundreds of craft classes. It's your online resource for all things creative, and it's perfect for people like me and you who never want to stop learning. Craftsy offers over 2,000 inspiring classes for makers of all skill levels with step-by-step instructions in more than 20 categories like knitting, cooking, sewing, painting, and a lot more. So whether you want to learn to make your own Tudor Christmas decorations, sew your own costumes, or tackle an artistic skill you've always wanted to try, there's a world-class expert there to teach you. Craftsy gives me the step-by-step instructions that I need to get started. I've made some beautiful Christmas cookies already, and I can't wait to start their hands-on Crafts for Kids series. That's why I'm so excited to offer you guys an amazing holiday deal valid for new subscribers only. The first 1,000 of my viewers to click the link below will get a full year of Craftsy for only $1.49. That's around £1, and it's normally $123. Head to go.craftsy.com/themuseumguide now. The link is just below. Remember, that's go.craftsy.com/themuseumguide. And now back to Hever Castle. Now let's head upstairs to the Boleyn apartment, but first, just look at this wonderful view out the window. We're going to come back and look at some other rooms downstairs, like the great dining hall, a little bit later on. But for now, this is the nursery of the Boleyn children. Some people believe that it was Anne's alone, but it's far more likely that Anne and Mary shared it, and George, who was much younger, probably started in a cradle like this. Of course, infant mortality was high in Tudor times, even for wealthy families. The Boleyns lost 2 children in infancy, one of whom, Henry, is buried in the nearby church in the village. Thomas and Elizabeth Boleyn weren't likely to have been involved in their children's day-to-day upbringing. A wet nurse would have fed the babies and cared for them in infancy through to their early childhood. When they reached school age, they would be educated and then sent away to prestigious posts in royal households. Mary was sent to the household of Mary Tudor, Henry VIII's sister. But Thomas recognized Anne's intelligence, and so she was sent to the Netherlands, to Brabant, in modern-day Belgium, when she was just 12 or 13, to join the household of the Archduchess Margaret and learn French and the continental way of life. We'll come back to Mary and Anne's time in Europe a little bit later on. Here's some more greenery on the window ledge and a placard about nativity plays, which were very popular. But you can see that all the way back in 1100, the Pope declared that the clergy could no longer act in these plays, so they were instead conducted by normal people, masked actors, called mummers. The plays were very exaggerated, like today's pantomimes, and the mummers would go door to door enacting scenes. While this tradition is now really uncommon in the UK, you can still see a mummers parade every New Year's Day in Philadelphia and in Newfoundland and Labrador around Christmas time. On the bed here, there's an abacus and some toys, and this bedspread decorated with unicorns. This really makes me think of the similarly aged Lady and the Unicorn tapestry, which is at the Musée Cluny in Paris. Last month, my November Patreon video was a tour of the medieval artifacts and objects at the Musée Cluny, and I really enjoyed filming it. There's a little board game here on the bed, and we're going to come back to this a bit later on. Maybe it's a Christmas gift for the girls. Now, let's enter the grand chamber. This was the heart of the Boleyn family's apartments, and it would be used for entertaining, for gathering as a family, and for special meals, of course, like this one at Christmas. We've jumped ahead in Anne's life. Here are Anne and her sister Mary in their early adulthood. They look late teens here. You can see the Yule log crackling away in the fireplace. There's also some getting prepared outside the castle here. The Yule log was a tradition brought to England from Scandinavia, where the Norse celebration of Yule marked the annual solstice when the days began to get longer again. A log decorated with ribbons and evergreen boughs would be lit with a stump of last year's log, the Yule brand. Ideally, it should burn for the entire 12 days, but if it went out, it was a symbol of bad fortune. Around the room, there's a frieze decorated with heraldic symbols of the Boleyn family and the Tudor rose. The table is set with a grand feast, and the walls are bedecked in rich fabrics, as well as the portraits of the monarch and his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Of course, Catherine of Aragon will soon fall afoul of Anne and Henry, but that is still a little bit down the road. Between their portraits is a lovely kissing bough. It looks like a wreath made of holly, ivy, and mistletoe, and just like today, that mistletoe was an invitation to kiss. A lot of the decorations here have to do with bringing the outside in. I mean, just have a look at them. The pine cones in the fireplace, the boughs of pine and greenery. Pine boughs have been collected and hung in the winter in England for thousands of years, even earlier than Christian worship in this country. Evergreens were likely cherished for their ability to stay alive through the coldest months, making them a symbol of eternal life, perfect for the Christian celebration of Christmas. So this is probably the first day of Christmas, Christmas Day. It officially began with midnight mass, where everyone wore their newest, best clothes. There was another church service in the morning called Matins, and then everybody would head home and sit down for a day of feasting. Plum porridge, which was a meaty stew made of wine and plums and broth and spices. And then the Tudor favorite that we can see here, a boar's head served up on a platter like this one. One of these is in my Christmas video of the Museum of the Home, which I'll link above. You might even get served a cockenthrice, this nightmare, which is the hind of a chicken stitched onto a pig's head. And yes, people did actually eat this. These were real. On the table, you can also see baskets of sugar plums, which are dried plums stuffed with crunchy nuts and rolled in sugar, as well as a stargazy pie. Now, this might not be fully accurate. Stargazy pie wasn't invented until the end of the 16th century, but you can see that it's got all these pilchard heads poking out of the top as if they're looking up into the sky. It originates in a village called Mousehole in Cornwall, so I don't think it would have been up here in Kent, but it looks great. The Boleyns would have had meat decorated with rosemary and bay leaves, lots of fruit, and everyone's table, including the lower classes, would be laden with pies, meat stuffing, frumenty, which was a sweet porridge, and lots of boiled puddings. Traditional Christmas pudding that we think of as being quite sweet and spiced was more of a savory, suet-based pudding in the Tudor era, and mincemeat pies were made with chopped mutton. That's why they were called meat. Also with dried fruits and honey to add sweetness. They would always include 13 ingredients to represent Christ and the apostles. Now the room smells lovely. It's redolent with cloves and spicy holiday scents. The Boleyns are wealthy, remember, and they can afford these exotic fruits like oranges studded with cloves and pomegranates. Remember, the Boleyns were in service to Catherine of Aragon, and her symbol was a pomegranate, owing to the Tudor hopes for her fertility, which of course didn't pan out too well. Look at this lovely wooden bust. Maybe it's one of the Boleyn girls. Now let's talk a little bit more about the next day of Christmas. The second day of Christmas, December 26th, is the feast of St. Stephen, which you might know from the song Good King Wenceslas. Remember, he looks out on the feast of Stephen, where the snow lay round about, deep and crisp and even. The Feast of St. Stephen was a day for charity. So as a very wealthy family, the Boleyns are going to give alms at church that are then distributed to the poor. However, even in Tudor times, this day was starting to be known as Boxing Day. The name has its origins in boxing up the Christmas leftovers and giving them to those in need.
I find it really fascinating that this room has been recreated based on two famous Tudor paintings. The first one here, The Ambassadors by Hans Holbein the Younger. That one's in my National Gallery video. And also this one, the portrait of Sir Thomas More and his family. This one's in the National Portrait Gallery.
Now we're entering the best bedchamber, great name, and we are also jumping ahead in Anne's life. This is likely where Thomas and Elizabeth slept when their children were young, but we do know that Anne slept here when she returned home later in her lifetime. The walls are lined with rich tapestries, and the bed is certainly fit for the master and the mistress of the house with its lovely canopy. You can also see this drawing here, made by Hans Holbein, sketched sometime between 1532 and 35, probably the most reliable image of what Anne Boleyn actually looked like. Let's just talk a little bit here about the next chapter in Mary and Anne's life. As tensions between France and England died down, Mary Boleyn went to live in France as Mary Tudor married Louis XII. And as the new Queen of France, she asks for Anne to come live with her too. So the two sisters will be her ladies-in-waiting. But Louis XII dies after just 3 months. Thomas has already sheepishly asked the Archduchess for Anne to be released from her household so she can't go back to Brabant. So instead, Anne is placed in the household of the new Queen Consort of France. She remains at the French court until 1521, and during this 7-year period, she became more French than French, immersing herself in the language, the culture, and the fashion, especially the French hood for which she was known, not to mention new evangelical ideas of religious reform. Mary Boleyn soon married in 1520 herself. Her wedding, where Henry VIII gave her away in the absence of her father, who was in France, also marked the beginning of her affair with Henry, who bought her husband Carey's compliance with many royal grants. He was willing to look the other way. Mary Boleyn and Henry VIII's dalliances continued for 4 years, with many wondering to this day if Mary's children, Elizabeth and Henry, were in fact fathered by the king. We're now walking through the staircase gallery, built under Anne of Cleves in the mid-16th century to give access between the two wings of the house and her newly built long gallery. We're going to walk through the long gallery shortly. And you can see here the next generation of Tudors, Elizabeth and Edward, later Elizabeth I and Edward VI. And we're going to come back to Elizabeth briefly a bit later on, because of course she was Anne Boleyn's daughter. Now here we can see the third day of Christmas is the Feast of St. John, which is all about wine, or maybe ale. St. John was said to have drunk a glass of poisoned wine without becoming ill, miraculously, so this was a time to really fill your glass. You might drink something called lamb's wool, which was beer with added spices and apples, or something similar called wassail. This was a day for wassailing. Wassail was hot ale or cider, mixed with sugar, spices, and apples, with a crust of bread at the bottom. The most important person in the household would drink first, and he'd make a toast shouting, "Wassail!" meaning for your health, and then pass it on. The next person would then shout, "Drink ale!" and the bowl would be passed around. Here I am at the Sandwich Medieval Centre last year having some wassail, and you can go wassailing door to door to your neighbors' houses, similar to mumming, and the traditions get kind of mixed up. We're entering into another bedchamber, and wait a second, there's a Christmas tree in here. This really isn't a period detail. Christmas trees don't really appear in England until around 1790. King George III's German wife, Queen Charlotte, missed her childhood traditions, and she had some decorated fir trees placed inside Windsor Castle. But the tradition really took off in England with Queen Victoria's husband, Prince Albert. He too was German and loved the Christmas tree. But even though it's not traditional in this room, it really does look nice. So let's pause here to catch up on our saga of Anne Boleyn. See, after her time at the French court, and in the midst of her sister's affair with the king, Anne returned to England in early 1522 to marry her cousin, James Butler, as you did at the time. However, the marriage was cancelled, and instead, Anne was again appointed a maid of honour to Queen Catherine of Aragon. Her match to Henry Percy was denied by Cardinal Wolsey, and it was around this time that Henry VIII started pursuing her in earnest. She resisted. After all, she had seen her sister Mary sleep with the king and then be cast aside, and Anne wanted more for herself. The king, of course, wanted what he couldn't have. Henry began focusing on having his marriage to Catherine annulled so he would be free to marry Anne and hopefully have the sons that he had been dreaming of. Here at this table, we can see a few love letters here for us to read from Henry to Anne. This is a copy of some of the 17 originals that are held by the Vatican Library. Why in Rome? Well, they were used in evidence when deciding if the Pope should grant Henry an annulment from Catherine of Aragon, which ultimately, of course, he decided against. When Henry initially proposed marriage, he still thought the annulment would happen. Anne came here to Hever over the Christmas holidays in 1526 to make up her mind, and she said yes. She accepted Henry's proposal with a letter and a symbolic New Year's Day gift in the form of a jewel with a maiden in a storm-tossed ship, which is probably how she felt. But of course, even though she said yes, things were not that easy. It turns out Wolsey couldn't obtain the annulment from Pope Clement VII, and so after 6 years of failed negotiations and an increasingly frustrated Henry, he broke England away from the church in Rome and founded his own church. He and Anne were finally wed in a secret ceremony in late 1532, and then formally married on 25th January 1533. Now, you've probably noticed this room, called the Henry VIII Bedchamber, has these delightfully cheesy mannequins of Henry and Anne, because it's thought that Henry VIII maybe visited this castle on several occasions during their courtship, but it's pretty doubtful that he ever actually slept here. This castle was simply too small for his grand presence, and he did own Penshurst Palace, which is just 3 miles to the north, and Bulbrook Castle, which is also nearby. Now, we'll come back to Anne and Henry again shortly, but for now, we can see the signs here about the 4th day of Christmas, December 28th, Childermas, more formally known as the Feast of the Holy Innocents. In an effort to remember the children murdered by King Herod as he tried to kill the baby Jesus, Tudor children, like Anne, Mary, and George, were whipped in the morning of December 28th to remind them of the suffering of the children in Bethlehem. Awful, right? Hopefully most parents weren't going too hard. But for the rest of the day, they did get to be in charge. Instead of the parents, the kids called the shots. This role reversal extended to the church even, where one choir boy would be selected and given the title the boy bishop. And he would lead sermons, which is still a tradition in Hereford and Salisbury cathedrals. Now in this next room, this would have once been a servant's dormitory, but today it's a gallery showcasing 2 of Anne Boleyn's books of hours, which we are so lucky to see. Let's have a closer look, but first, this is a good place for us to talk about the final years of Anne's life. In some ways they were the happiest, but of course they were also the most tragic. After their wedding, Anne soon fell pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl, Elizabeth. Henry was disappointed, but he knew that Anne was young and could have more children. However, the combination of a head injury during jousting and 2 miscarriages left Henry feeling suspicious and angry. The things that made Anne a good mistress made her a bad wife, and she was unpopular with Henry's trusted advisors, who began to poison the king's ear against her. Not to mention, he had spotted one of her ladies-in-waiting, Jane Seymour. On the 2nd of May, Anne was arrested for high treason and sent to the Tower of London, where she was tried and found guilty, just about 3.5 years after their wedding. She was beheaded on the 19th of May, 1536. Henry did her a small kindness. Instead of the axeman, he had a swordsman brought from France. French to the end, our Anne Boleyn. During her execution, Henry was already dancing with Jane Seymour across town. That's why it is kind of grisly that in this room they have a replica sword similar to the kind that would have been used for her execution. Of course, Anne did have the last laugh. Henry was so obsessed with having a son that he ultimately married 4 more times, and the one son that he did have died young, at the age of 14. Elizabeth, daughter with Anne Boleyn, would go on to become his greatest legacy, ruling over England during a period of time called the Golden Age and the Great Elizabethan Era. Now back to Anne Boleyn's Books of Hours. Books of Hours were personal prayer books popular from the 13th century until the Reformation in the 1530s. During this period, short services to the Virgin Mary were read regularly at 8 fixed, quote, hours during the day. That's where the name Book of Hours comes from. You were constantly praying from these books, and you could have one made to order or you could buy a printed one. This first book was made to order in Bruges between 1410 and 1450. It's what's called an illuminated manuscript, which means it's handwritten and it's been hand decorated with gold, silver, and other materials to give it a luminous effect. It wasn't made for Anne, but it was very special, and she has written in it. She wrote Le temps viendra, the time will come, and Je Anne Boleyn, I Anne Boleyn, as well as drawing an astrolabe as a symbol of time. The second book was printed in Paris in 1528, making it a little bit less unique, but it was printed on vellum instead of paper, so it was a lot more expensive. There's a third of Anne's books of hours at the British Library that has even more personalization, as well as notes from Henry in the margins. We may be at the end of Anne's life, but we have a few more rooms to visit and days of Christmas to explore. Now we're walking through the long gallery, which was constructed in the 16th century by Anne of Cleves. The woman knew what she liked after all, and of course what she didn't like, and what she didn't like was Henry VIII. But she ends up getting off the best out of all of his 6 wives. She lives out the rest of her days here in this beautiful castle, acting as the king's sister. She definitely needs her own video. This gallery extends across the entire width of the castle and was used for entertaining and displaying art. But today, that purpose still continues because this is an exhibition of portraits of Tudors and key figures in the Wars of the Roses. There's 24 portraits here, all hung in dynastic order, starting with Henry VI and ending with Henry VIII. And of course, just like the tree we saw in the Henry VIII bedchamber, these trees are not period accurate, but they do look wonderful anyway. Now here's another child's room. This is styled more like a Victorian room, so it's maybe showing the house in the Astor era or even earlier, but it does look so nice and festive. And here we can see the 7th day of Christmas, which was New Year's Eve. That's a day for hunting, card games, dice, and archery. The Boleyns would have had a day full of fun, including some parlor games that we still play today, like hide and seek. There would have been a lot of places to hide in this house. Let's head back to that first nursery for the 8th day of Christmas, which occurs on January 1st, New Year's Day. Have a look at the canopied bed. There's that little game here. Now this might be a little gift for Anne and her sister Mary. This was the traditional day to give gifts, and they were really only exchanged by the upper and middle classes. The poor gave gifts to their lord or maybe even to the king. Adults might exchange food, spices, and even money, while children got small toys and sweets like this. It was uncommon to wrap them, so the wrap gifts that we see here in this room, this is more of the Victorian style. And while Father Christmas does date back to the Middle Ages here in Britain, it's unlikely that he gave the Boleyn girls these gifts. He comes a bit later in our popular culture. He kind of melds with the Dutch tradition of Sinterklaas and the Turkish Saint Nicholas and the Coca-Cola Santa Claus, and he becomes much more popular in the 19th and 20th centuries. And just before we head downstairs, you can see this little small room. It's likely a servant's quarter, but it looks very nice and cozy. We're back downstairs now, standing in the center of the inner hall. Let's really appreciate every detail all around us, with the fire crackling and the large Christmas tree. This was the great kitchen in the Tudor period, but was reimagined in 1905 as part of William Waldorf Astor's restoration. Again, if you're interested in a more general tour of the castle, let me know in the comments. The gallery above the hall was inspired by the rood screen at King's College Chapel in Cambridge, and the ceiling has been redone in the Elizabethan style, incorporating Tudor rose emblems. Now let's talk about the 10th day of Christmas, the Feast of Fools, my favorite. On the Feast of Fools, the master of an estate would go to his staff and household and elect a Lord of Misrule. And I love the fact that in Scotland he was called the Abbot of Unreason. He'd be the master of ceremonies for a day of debauchery and misbehavior, entitled to make anyone in the house do whatever he wished. So it is similar to Childermas in that it's a role reversal, a flipping around of the expected social classes. Now here we're in the Great Hall, and we're going to end our tour here today in this showstopper of a room. Wow. This was the Boleyns' Great Hall, built in the 15th century and originally open to the roof rafters. The table has been set to have a grand feast, and that's because it's the penultimate day of Christmas and one of the most fun, the 5th of January, also known as Twelfth Night. Twelfth Night marked the night before the Feast of the Epiphany, which signified the coming of the wise men to visit the baby Jesus in Bethlehem. Today, it might just be the day that we take our decorations down and get rid of our tree, but in Tudor times, this was a big bash to signal the end of Christmas. People celebrated it with great feasts, games, and plays. You simply had to have a 12th night cake, and which would have coins or beans hidden inside, and whoever found those objects would become the king or queen of the bean, and they had to host the evening's entertainment and lead rounds of singing, dancing, and games. Just look at these wonderful details. This is a 1905 minstrel's balcony carved in the Tudor style, just like the inner hall that we saw. The corbels have been designed to look like musicians. Look at all the different ones. So cool. Here's a great painting of the Yule log tradition here at Hever, and at the back of the room, behind the richly set table, there's beakers filled with brightly colored liquids. That might not be period appropriate, but it sure looks great. The tapestry is stunning as well, and wow, my husband pointed this out to me. Just look at these elaborate locks on the doors. And then it's the final day of Christmas. Epiphany. After church services, people ate roasted lamb and Epiphany tart, a kind of giant jam tart made in the shape of a star. While people left up their decorations until Candlemas on the 2nd of February, the 12 days of Christmas were over for another year. Now, there's certainly more to see here at Hever, particularly the rooms decked out in the early 20th century interior decor to represent the Astor's time here. You can see those now, and the stunning gardens and lake, but perhaps this would be better filmed in the summer when everything is in full bloom. So do let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in another Hever Castle tour.
Well, that's the end of our tour, and I hope you've enjoyed looking around Hever Castle with me. I'll see you the next time I'm at the museum. Merry Christmas and happy holidays, everyone.